Edwin Carver's hands were stained with oil and peppered with tiny metal shavings, and he barely noticed. He wasn't a general. He wasn't even a soldier. It's just a machinist in Dayton, Ohio, staring at a rifle scope mounting ring and thinking about something nobody else seemed to care about. The scopes kept drifting. Snipers missed shots they shouldn't have. Lives were being risked because the metal wasn't behaving the way anyone expected. And Eddie was about to make a change that would alter the battlefield from Normandy to Okinawa. The supervisors called it stupid. The engineers said it was unnecessary. Bureaucrats labeled it a waste of time. But Eddie knew better. Midnight in a fluorescent-lit workshop, coffee cold at his side, he filed away a tiny groove into a metal ring, trusting his hands, trusting his instincts, trusting that what he was doing might just save American lives. War, Eddie realized, didn't wait for paperwork. It didn't wait for approvals, memos, or signatures. Sometimes the best ideas came from the people nobody was listening to. And sometimes the smallest modification, the tiniest groove cut into solid steel could make the difference between hitting a target and missing by miles, between life and death. Somewhere across the Pacific, Eddie's cousin Marcus gripped a sniper rifle and cursed. The scope had drifted again. Eddie didn't know it yet, but what he was about to do in that dimly lit Ohio workshop would give men like Marcus a chance to fight another day. The problem seemed small, the solution even smaller. But sometimes the smallest changes make the biggest difference. The winter of 1943 in Dayton, Ohio was unforgiving. Cold seeped through every crack of the Army Ordnance Inspection Facility where Edwin Carver spent 12 hours. A day examining rifle components destined for soldiers fighting on distant shores. At 31, Eddie was too old for the draft, too essential to leave his post, and yet every day he felt the weight of the war pressing on him, not just in the factory, but in the letters he received from his cousin, Marcus, a Marine sniper somewhere in the Pacific. Eddie's job was simple, in theory. Parts arrived on the line, he inspected them, stamped those that met specifications, and sent them forward. But Eddie was never content with good enough. He questioned tolerances, probed material choices, and meticulously documented every anomaly. Most of his reports were ignored. Production quotas mattered more than the subtle failings of metal that only someone with years of hands-on experience could notice. It was in one such letter from Marcus that Eddie first saw the real-world consequences of these minor imperfections. The scopes on their rifles wouldn't hold zero. Shots that should have been dead on were missed. Marcus wrote about watching enemies escape, about snipers losing faith in their equipment, about the anxiety and danger that came with every misaligned scope. The problem wasn't just mechanical, it was life and death. Eddie studied the mounting rings carefully, machined from solid steel. They seemed perfect on paper. A war introduced forces no specification could fully anticipate. Recoil, vibrations, harmonics, even microscopic shifts could turn a clean shot into a miss. Late nights in the workshop became Eddie's ritual. With a file in hand, he examined rejected parts, sketched ideas, ran calculations, and imagined how slight changes could absorb shock and stabilize the scope. The factory smelled of gun oil and metal dust. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside, snow drifted across Dayton streets. Inside, Eddie was consumed by one thought. If he could fix this, he could save lives. And maybe, just maybe, the Army would. Listen, Eddie couldn't stop thinking about the problem. Every day on the factory floor, as rifle parts slid past on the assembly line, his mind replayed Marcus's letters, missed shots, frustrated snipers, lives endangered. The mounting rings looked perfect to everyone else, but Eddie knew better. Precision on paper didn't always translate to performance in the field. Recoil, vibrations, even the subtle harmonics of a firing rifle could shift a scope's alignment. Just enough to ruin a shot? Late nights became Eddie's laboratory. The factory was quiet. The hum of fluorescent lights, the only company he had besides Walter, was the night security guard, who tolerated Eddie's tinkering as long as it didn't interfere with production. Eddie examined rejected scope mounts under magnification, studying every angle, every micro-imperfection. His intuition whispered that the rigid metal might be transferring too much shock to the scope. What if, he wondered, a controlled point of flex could absorb the energy instead of transmitting it? With a small file, he cut a tiny groove into the inner surface of one ring. It's barely noticeable, a few thousandths of an inch deep. It was a calculated gamble. The groove changed how the metal handled stress, allowing it to flex slightly and dissipate. Vibrations? Eddie sketched, measured, adjusted, and repeated the process on a handful of parts. It was meticulous, painstaking work, and entirely unauthorized. When he brought his observations to his supervisor, Gerald Hutchinson, the response was discouraging but predictable. "Carver, we have engineers for this," Hutchinson said, brushing aside Eddie's reports. "Your job is inspection, not redesign. So mounting rings meet specifications. Field issues are not our concern," Eddie argued, citing Marcus's letters and the practical failures he'd observed. But bureaucracy and chain of command proved immovable. Refusing to be defeated, Eddie took matters into his own hands. He bought a second-hand hunting rifle, fabricated makeshift mounts, and tested his groove concept in a friend's field, firing side by side with a control mount. The results were undeniable. The standard mount shifted after 20 rounds. His modified mount held 0 with remarkable consistency. Armed with photographs, notes, and measured data, Eddie returned to Hutchinson, but the reaction was the same. Too informal, too unverified, too stupid, as the engineers would later call it. Every night, Eddie wrestled with risk and responsibility. Modifying military equipment without authorization could cost him his job or worse, but watching Marcus and other snipers struggle with drifting scopes, knowing the consequences, left him no choice. Guided by conviction and technical intuition, he began quietly adding the tension groove to a portion of scope mounts during his shifts. He worked methodically, never leaving obvious traces, modifying just enough parts to impact field performance without drawing attention. Weeks turned into months. Eddie lived in a constant state of tension. Every passing supervisor, every inspection visit, filled him with dread. What if someone discovered the unauthorized work? Yet letters from Marcus kept arriving, vague yet urgent, describing continued problems and sometimes hinting at near misses in the field. Eddie knew that every groove he filed might be saving lives. By early 1944, the effects were starting to show. Reports from snipers indicated subtle improvements in scope stability, though. The Army couldn't identify why. The mystery of increased accuracy reached technical services. It's prompting official investigations, but they focused on engineering and assembly, not floor machinists. Eddie's work remained hidden in plain sight, and so, with each quiet modification, each sleepless night, Eddie moved closer to a moment that could change the course of American sniper operations. His stupid fix was no longer a hypothesis, it was a weapon in itself, ready to prove its worth in ways bureaucracy could never foresee. By spring of 1944, the first batch of rifles with Eddie's tension groove modification was in the field. Eddie didn't know the exact numbers. He had no way of tracking which mounts had been altered, which snipers were using them, but the reports began trickling in, almost by accident. Marcus's letters were different now. Tone had shifted, from frustration to cautious optimism. The scopes held 0. Shots that once drifted now landed precisely where they were aimed. Eddie read the letters late one night, the lines blurring as he imagined Marcus lying in a foxhole, rifle steady, crosshairs locked on a target that could tip a battle. It's a thought made his chest tighten. Somewhere across the Pacific, his small groove in a tiny piece of steel was saving lives. He realized, with a mix of pride and fear, that the stakes of his actions were higher than he had ever imagined. The Army began to notice. Field reports from sniper units highlighted unusual consistency and accuracy, rifles performing beyond expected tolerances. Technical services launched a formal investigation. Inspectors arrived at the Dayton factory, combing through assembly lines, reviewing processes, and questioning engineers. Eddie watched silently from the edges, heart hammering with every passing glance. Fearing discovery, yet relieved that something was finally being recognized. Then came the meeting. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Frost, lead inspector, presented the preliminary findings. Photographs of target patterns, Detailed data charts and field reports filled the room. Frost paused, adjusting his glasses, and said the words Eddie had both feared and hoped to hear. "We have identified a consistent improvement in scope stability, but no one can explain the cause." Eddie's heart raced. Okay. Everyone around him speculated materials, assembly tweaks, batch differences, but none accounted for the leap in performance. Frost's eyes scanned the room, settling on the assembly line managers and engineers. "We need to know who implemented this modification. Whoever did it, we want them to continue it and improve upon it immediately." A silence fell. Eddie stood frozen in the back, realization dawning. The tiny grooves he had added in secret, the work done in the dead of night, were now the reason American snipers were hitting targets they couldn't before. Lives had been saved, missions succeeded, and battles potentially turned. He could remain hidden, let the mystery persist, or step forward and claim responsibility. The room buzzed with speculation, accusations, and wonder. And then, in a voice he barely recognized as his own, Eddie spoke. "Sir, I made those modifications." Edwin Carver. All eyes turned, Hutchinson's face drained of color. Frost leaned forward, curious. Eddie explained everything: the testing on the hunting rifle, the groove, the months of unauthorized work. The letters from Marcus, the risks he had taken. Didn't embellish. He didn't justify beyond necessity. He told the truth. The room was stunned. Engineers debated, managers whispered. Some demanded punishment, others marveled at the ingenuity. Frost listened carefully, then nodded slowly. "The principle is sound, controlled flex, vibration damping. It's elegant, and it's working." Okay. Eddie felt a weight lift, a mix of relief, fear, and vindication. His small, stupid fix had become a life-saving innovation. The snipers were hitting their marks. The rifles performed beyond expectations. A machinist from Dayton, Ohio, had made it happen. The room had emptied except for Eddie, Hutchinson, and Lieutenant Colonel Frost. Whispers still lingered in the corners, as everyone digested what had just happened. Eddie's hands shook slightly, a mix of adrenaline and lingering fear. He had just admitted 2 months of unauthorized modifications to military equipment. Every rule, every protocol, every procedure had been broken, but for the first time. He felt the relief of knowing he had done the right thing. Hutchinson, normally all business, stared at him with a complex expression, half anger, half awe. "Carver, you really went behind our backs," he said, voice low. "You could have been fired, arrested." "I know, sir," Eddie replied evenly, though his heart was still pounding. The rifles weren't performing. Soldiers were dying. I had to act. Frost leaned back, thoughtful. "You did the right thing, Mr. Carver. The groove you designed is simple, elegant, and effective. It's improving sniper performance across the theaters. Lives have already been saved because of you." Eddie wanted to say more, to explain the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, the private modifications done under the cover of his own shifts, but he felt a sudden lightness, realizing that his work had been validated. Frost's words gave him permission to breathe, to acknowledge quietly that he had made a difference without needing external recognition. In the following days, the Army moved quickly. The tension groove modification was formally incorporated into production specifications. Engineers refined the dimensions, optimized placement, and implemented quality control to ensure consistency. The rifles being assembled now carried Eddie's idea, not as an act of rebellion, but as official policy. Yet Eddie's mind remained restless. He couldn't stop thinking about the soldiers in the field, the Marines, relying on precision to survive. Every letter from Marcus was a lifeline, a reminder that his work had meaning beyond factory walls. When he opened the latest correspondence, Marcus described a high-value target that had previously escaped due to scope drift. With the new rifles, the shot hit. Eddie smiled despite himself, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. Still, the question lingered. What if someone investigated and traced the modification back to him? A risk hadn't vanished. It had simply transformed. Now, instead of clandestine guilt, there was cautious optimism. Frost and the technical teams seemed to understand the value of practical innovation. Tay and Hutchinson's grudging respect provided a buffer against administrative backlash. Katie was learning that courage in action often walked hand in hand with patience and discretion. Outside the factory, Dayton continued its wartime rhythm. Snow thawed into rain, trains carried materials to distant ports, and the world rumbled toward new battles. Inside, Eddie returned to his inspections. No longer a silent saboteur, but a quiet innovator. His work had officially changed the capabilities of American snipers. Even as recognition slowly filtered upward, Katie remained grounded. He never sought headlines or medals. His satisfaction came from knowing the groove he filed late at night had translated into measurable impact precision, reliability, survival. He understood now that the greatest victories often went unseen, measured not in applause but in the lives spared, the missions accomplished, and the quiet pride of having acted rightly when no one else would. And somewhere across the ocean, Marcus continued to take deadly accurate shots, unaware that a cousin's hands in a dim Ohio workshop had made it possible. By mid-1944, Eddie's tension groove modification was no longer a secret. Production facilities across the country were instructed to implement the change, and engineers refined his original design, standardizing the groove dimensions and placement. What had started as a quiet, risky act by one machinist had transformed into an official military innovation. Eddie watched from the factory floor as new batches of mounting rings rolled down the line, each one carrying a subtle yet vital improvement. The effect in the field was immediate and undeniable. Snipers reported unprecedented accuracy retention. Under combat conditions, rifles held their zero through the jarring recoil of repeated firing. During transport over rough terrain, and even after being subjected to harsh tropical climates. The improvement wasn't just mechanical, it changed the confidence and effectiveness of the men in the field, Marcus wrote again, describing how entire patrols now relied on sniper teams for cover with renewed trust in their weapons. Missions that had previously been impossible or deadly were now executed with precision. Word reached Eddie indirectly through letters, factory reports, and whispers from colleagues. Soldiers were surviving ambushes they would have been forced to abandon. Critical targets were neutralized, often with a single well-placed shot. Commanders began citing the consistency of the rifles in tactical assessments. Eddie, who had once felt powerless in the face of bureaucracy, realized that his small modification was shifting the course of engagements. Thousands of miles away. Despite the growing recognition of his work, Eddie remained humble. He continued his inspection duties with meticulous care, ensuring every part met specifications, but now with the satisfaction that he had made a difference. Occasionally, engineers asked for his input on minor design tweaks. The first time, his expertise and intuition were respected rather than dismissed. Hutchinson, his formerly inflexible supervisor, even sought his advice on quality control issues, acknowledging that practical knowledge from the factory floor could solve problems theoretical designs might miss. The Army formally documented the tension groove modification in technical manuals. And while Eddie's name was recorded in internal reports, it was never publicized. To the broader world, the rifles were simply more reliable. To Eddie, however, each accurate shot fired by a sniper in the Pacific or Europe carried personal meaning. He imagined Marcus, steady behind the scope, taking out an enemy officer with a rifle that held its aim perfectly his own hands, albeit indirectly, had saved lives. Letters from Marcus became less about complaints and more about gratitude. He described how sniper teams were achieving results previously thought impossible, how confidence in their equipment had transformed operations, and occasionally he hinted at victories that might never be recorded. Eddie read every letter carefully, knowing that somewhere his ingenuity had bridged the gap between theory and survival. As months passed, Eddie's role evolved. He no longer needed to modify rings in secret. The Army had adopted his principle officially. He focused on improving inspection processes and assisting engineers in understanding practical challenges faced on the line. It's a morale boost of contributing. Something tangible to the war effort strengthened his resolve by the end of the year. Eddie understood the full impact of his stupid fix. It had saved lives, restored confidence, and improved battlefield effectiveness on a scale he could really quantify. It also taught him a lasting lesson: courage, initiative, and the willingness to act even when rules seem immovable could alter history in subtle but profound ways. Eddie Carver, machinist from Dayton, Ohio, had taken a simple idea, trusted his instincts, and quietly changed the face of American sniper warfare. The summer of 1944 brought a new wave of tension to the Dayton factory. Army inspectors returned, this time not for routine checks, but to conduct a full-scale review of production practices and field performance data. Eddie knew why they were really here. The rifles were performing beyond expectations, and someone needed to take responsibility. The air inside the facility was thick with anticipation. Workers whispered about the mysterious improvements, none aware of the quiet machinist behind the innovation. Lieutenant Colonel Frost, now a familiar figure, walked the floor with an air of authority tempered by curiosity. Engineers, managers, and military officers crowded the conference room, reviewing reports, photographs of target patterns, and field data. Frost paused, eyes scanning the room. The rifles produced here are showing consistent accuracy improvements unmatched elsewhere. We know a modification was made, but official records show no authorized changes. This needs to be accounted for immediately. Eddie's pulse quickened. He had anticipated this moment for months, the potential for recognition, but also for severe repercussions. Hutchinson leaned close, whispering, "Carver, this could go badly if they find out." Eddie nodded silently. The risk was real, but he had accepted it long ago. He had already lived with the anxiety, the clandestine nights, the fear of discovery. Frost called for a demonstration. 2 rifles were brought into the room, one standard, one modified. Engineers fired them using precise instruments to measure point of impact shift over repeated rounds. The difference was undeniable. The modified rifle held 0 almost perfectly, while the standard rifle drifted, even under controlled conditions. Murmurs rippled through the audience. It was no longer a mystery. The modification worked. At that moment, Eddie realized he could no longer remain in the shadows. Stepping forward, he cleared his throat, the weight of months of secrecy pressing down. "Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Frost, I made those modifications," he said, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Every eye in the room turned toward him. Hutchinson's face paled. Engineers froze mid-note, and Frost studied him closely. "I added the tension groove to mounting rings," Eddie continued, describing the principle of controlled flex to absorb vibrations without shifting the scope. He explained his initial tests with a hunting rifle, his months of careful modifications on the factory floor, and his motivation letters from his cousin, Marcus, detailing the life or death importance of precise scopes in the Pacific Theater. The room erupted into a mixture of shock, admiration, and outrage. Some called it sabotage. Others marveled at the ingenuity. Frost held up a hand for silence. "We now understand the source of the improvement," he said. "Mr. Carver, your work has demonstrably enhanced sniper effectiveness and saved lives. While your methods were unorthodox, the results cannot be ignored." Eddie felt a mix of relief and fear. The months of secrecy, the risk of court-martial, the sleepless nights, they were all coming to a head. Engineers crowded him, asking detailed questions about the groove, its placement, and testing methodology. Hutchinson, his old supervisor, shook his head, muttering, "You really went behind my back. But you were right." Frost turned to the assembly of engineers and officers. "You recommend formal adoption of this modification immediately. Mr. Carver's work will be officially recognized and incorporated into all production lines. Further, we will study retrofitting rifles in the field." The decision was Historica Machinist, previously dismissed as inconsequential, had revolutionized equipment design and proven that practical knowledge often surpassed theoretical planning. Eddie's stomach relaxed slightly as he realized the tension had lifted. The gamble he had taken, the sleepless nights, the secret modifications, had paid off. Soldiers were alive because of his hands, his intuition, and his courage to act when bureaucracy failed. The room buzzed with discussions of implementation. But Eddie's mind drifted for a moment to Marcus, imagining him taking accurate shots with rifles that now performed as they should. It was a victory that went far beyond paperwork or accolades. Eddie Carver had changed the course of sniper warfare, one precise groove at a time. The weeks following the Army's acknowledgement of Eddie's modification brought a mixture of relief, tension, and newfound respect. Production lines continued, humming in Dayton, but the atmosphere had subtly shifted. Colleagues who had once dismissed him as a meddling machinist now approached with questions, some cautiously seeking guidance, others openly admiring his insight. Eddie moved through the factory quietly, still focused on inspection, but now with a sense of purpose, heavier than ever before. He knew his work was saving lives, and that knowledge carried both pride and weight. Hutchinson, who had once epitomized bureaucratic rigidity, softened in his demeanor, stopped by Eddie's station with a clipboard in hand, asking for his advice on assembly tolerances and quality checks. "Carver," he said one afternoon, "I never thought I'd admit this, but your hands-on understanding of these parts, it's invaluable. We should have listened sooner." Eddie offered a simple nod, aware that validation from Hutchinson was rare praise indeed. Beyond the factory walls, letters from Marcus kept arriving, now filled with stories of sniper teams executing missions with a precision that previously seemed impossible. Marcus recounted how the Marines could trust their scopes even after days of combat, how small squads made strategic strikes that shaped larger battles, and occasionally hinted at how many lives were spared thanks to reliable equipment. Eddie read each letter with careful attention, feeling the invisible bond between his midnight experiments and the soldiers' victories thousands of miles. Eddie's modification had caught the attention of military engineers nationwide. They requested interviews, sketches, and notes, all to understand the principle behind the tension groove. Though the concept was simple, Eddie's experience and intuition had executed it perfectly. He realized that practical innovation often depended on trust in one's own knowledge, on courage to act when the system failed to respond. Engineers debated refining the groove using advanced calculations or adapting it to new rifle models, but the foundation remained Eddie's original insight. Despite recognition from some quarters, Eddie remained cautious. The bureaucracy was never entirely forgiving, and he understood the line between innovation and insubordination all too well. He avoided boasting, content to see results rather than claim credit. The thrill of knowing his work was in use, performing perfectly under fire, outweighed any desire for accolades. At night, when he sat with Helen on the porch after long shifts, would reflect on how one small modification, one carefully filed groove, had changed countless lives. The Army also began to document his work internally, while the public remained unaware. Eddie's name appeared in technical manuals and production notes. Young engineers in training learned of the Machinist's modification as a case study in practical problem-solving. It became an example of how frontline insight could complement theoretical design. Quiet revolution embedded in institutional knowledge. Yet even amidst recognition, Eddie grappled with lingering anxiety. He had taken risks, defied rules, and worked secretly. What if something went wrong? What if scrutiny revealed a flaw? But with each positive report from the field, his doubts diminished. He realized that courage often meant acting without certainty, trusting one's instincts and accepting consequences for the greater good. By the end of the summer, Eddie felt a measure of peace. The rifles performed flawlessly, snipers trusted their equipment, and the factory had embraced a culture that valued practical problem-solving. Though his actions remained largely hidden outside military circles, Eddie knew the impact of his work, and that was enough. In quiet moments, he pictured Marcus behind the scope, confident, precise, and alive. That connection, forged through metal, letters, and conviction, was the true measure of Eddie's success. Eddie Carver had started as a machinist, a man with a small idea, stubborn refusal to accept flawed equipment, and the courage to act. By daring to fix what others ignored, he had left a legacy that endured long after the war, embedded, not just in steel, but in the lives he saved. The ripple effect of Eddie's tension groove modification began to reach every corner of the American military. Reports from sniper units across the Pacific and European theaters consistently showed unprecedented accuracy retention. Mission after mission, snipers were able to rely on their rifles with a certainty that had previously been impossible. Enemy officers fell to shots that were once missed. Strategic positions were neutralized with efficiency, and the morale of small units soared, knowing that their equipment could be trusted. Eddie's small modification, imperceptible to the untrained eye, transformed combat outcomes thousands of miles from Dayton, Ohio. Back at the factory, production teams implemented the groove officially, incorporating Eddie's principle into every scope mounting ring. Engineers refined the design, but the core idea remained untouched. It became standard protocol for all new sniper rifles, and soon, retrofitting programs ensured older weapons were upgraded wherever possible. For the first time, Eddie felt the full magnitude of what he had accomplished. His sleepless nights, secret modifications, and relentless persistence weren't just solving a problem, they were changing the war. Despite the official adoption of his innovation, Eddie remained humble. He accepted commendations quietly, knowing that his greatest reward wasn't a medal or public recognition, but the knowledge that soldiers like Marcus were safer. He corresponded with engineers and historians, explaining his methods and the logic behind the groove, careful to remain factual and precise. He didn't need headlines. He needed results, and the results were undeniable. The letters from Marcus became more frequent and detailed. Eddie read accounts of missions where sniper teams could hold their positions for hours, adjusting to environmental changes without recalibrating their scopes. Marcus wrote about a sense of confidence returning to the men, a trust in their rifles that allowed them to focus on strategy rather than equipment. Eddie imagined those soldiers standing silently, eyes behind crosshairs, bullets finding their mark with unwavering precision, and he felt a quiet, profound satisfaction. The impact of Eddie's work went beyond individual missions. Military tacticians began reevaluating sniper deployment strategies, knowing that accurate rifles could reliably extend operational reach. Commanders planned operations that previously carried higher risk. It's confident that long-range precision fire could achieve objectives with fewer casualties. Eddie's groove, a seemingly minor alteration. It amplified the effectiveness of American forces across 2 continents. At home, life continued with a sense of normalcy, but Eddie's perspective had shifted. The war had taught him the value of initiative, of practical knowledge, and of courage under bureaucratic resistance. He shared these lessons subtly with colleagues, mentoring younger machinists and inspiring them to trust their experience while respecting procedure. He became a quiet example of how one person, willing to act decisively in the face of indifference, could create change far greater than anticipated. Even after the war ended, Eddie's modification remained embedded in military doctrine. Sniper rifles used in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond carried the principle he pioneered, refined by engineers, but fundamentally unchanged. Eddie never sought fame. He had no desire for headlines. Satisfaction came from knowing that somewhere, soldiers were alive because of his decision to act, to trust his instincts, and to prioritize human lives over rigid protocol. Years later, when he looked back on that cold winter of 1943, he realized how close he had come to failing, not because the idea was flawed, but because no one had been willing to listen. Story became a quiet testament to the power of individual initiative, a reminder that sometimes the right course of action lies outside the boundaries of procedure. And though the world would never fully know the machinist who saved lives with a simple groove in a rifle mount, Eddie Carver knew, and that knowledge, silently carried through decades, was enough. The war ended, but the echoes of Eddie Carver's midnight experiments lingered long after the guns fell silent. Factories across America slowly transitioned from rifles to cars, appliances, and peacetime production. Dayton's ordnance facility, once a hub of relentless wartime urgency, quieted as the demand for military hardware diminished. Yet the impact of Eddie's tension groove continued to resonate on distant battlefields, where snipers relied on rifles carrying his silent innovation. For Eddie, life returned to routine, but the weight of what he had accomplished remained. He went back to inspecting parts, now openly advising on quality control improvements, but without the urgency or secrecy that had defined his wartime work. Colleagues respected him more than ever, though most didn't fully grasp the scale of what he had done. Hutchinson, once the epitome of bureaucracy, had softened into a manager who occasionally sought Eddie's counsel. Acknowledging the value of hands-on expertise that complemented the engineer's theoretical knowledge, Eddie's connection with Marcus endured after the war. When Marcus returned home in 1946, the first visit was to Eddie and Helen's modest Dayton home. The reunion was quiet but profound, a mix of relief, gratitude, and unspoken acknowledgement of the role Eddie had played in keeping Marcus and his comrades alive. Over beers in the backyard, they laughed, recounted old hunting stories, and avoided dwelling on the horrors of war. Yet both knew the truth. His lives had been saved by a small groove filed by a machinist in Ohio. Official recognition for Eddie remained modest. He received commendation letters and a small monetary award from the Army Ordnance Department, enough to purchase war bonds and earn their gratitude, but never public accolades. In the eyes of the general public, Eddie Carver was simply a machinist who had done his duty. In the quiet corridors of military engineering, however, his name became a subtle legend, referenced in reports and manuals. It's an example of practical ingenuity and the value of initiative under constraints. Over the ensuing decades, Eddie built a quiet, ordinary life. He and Helen raised 2 children in a modest home, worked steadily in peacetime manufacturing, and remained active in their community. He rarely spoke of the war or the rifles that had carried his groove into combat, though he kept letters from Marcus and a few sketches of his original designs. These small artifacts were a private testament to the difference one person could make when they refused to accept problems as immutable. The ripple effects of Eddie's work persisted even as military technology evolved. Sniper rifles, used in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts, incorporated principles derived from Eddie's groove, refined with modern materials and precision engineering, but fundamentally rooted in his concept of controlled flex and vibration damping. Generations of soldiers unknowingly benefited from his insight, each successful shot a silent tribute to the machinist who had acted when no one else would. In later years, historians and engineers pieced together Eddie's contribution through oral histories, technical records, and field reports, though he never sought recognition. He occasionally received letters from those who had studied sniper development, seeking his first-hand account. Eddie shared his experiences willingly, emphasizing lessons about initiative, responsibility, and courage rather than personal glory. For him, the true reward was knowing that thousands of lives had been spared because he had trusted his instincts and acted decisively. Eddie Carver passed away in 1992, surrounded by family, quietly leaving behind a legacy invisible to most, but monumental in its consequences. His obituary mentioned his wartime service, but few understood the depth of his contribution. Outside military circles, Eddie's story remained largely unknown, yet in the rifles, the manuals, and the countless lives preserved, his impact endured, a testament to how one determined individual, armed with skill, courage, and conviction, could change the course of history. The machinist's groove lived on. Every sniper who trusted their rifle scope, every mission executed with precision, carried a piece of Eddie's quiet genius. And though the world moved forward, modern technology building ever more sophisticated systems, the lesson remained timeless: ingenuity and courage, even from the most unassuming sources, could ripple through time, shaping outcomes in ways both visible and invisible. Edwin, Eddie Carver, never sought fame. He never imagined his midnight experiments in a dim Ohio workshop would ripple across battlefields thousands of miles away. Yet, through a simple groove filed into a steel scope mount, he had saved lives, restored confidence to snipers, and quietly changed the course of World War II operations in his later years. Eddie reflected on those tense nights of secrecy and the countless letters from his cousin Marcus, realizing that courage often looks like quiet determination rather than heroic spectacle. He understood that rules and bureaucracy, while necessary, could sometimes blind people to simple solutions. And when no one listened, it took initiative and a willingness to take risks to bridge the gap between knowledge and action. Though the world largely forgot his name, Eddie's work lived on. Every sniper who trusted their rifle's scope, every shot that hit its mark, carried a silent testament to his insight. Modern rifle designs owe a piece of their reliability to the machinist who refused to accept that a problem should remain unsolved simply because it wasn't officially recognized. Eddie passed away in 1992, surrounded by family, leaving behind a quiet life and an extraordinary legacy. His story, embedded in military manuals and whispered among engineers, serves as a timeless reminder. Sometimes the smallest hands can wield the greatest influence. And one person's determination to do what's right, no matter the odds, can echo through history. In the end, Eddie Carver was more than a machinist. It was proof that ingenuity, courage, and conviction can quietly change the world, and that even the simplest fix, when guided by care and expertise, can leave an impact far greater than anyone ever imagined.